So, hi everyone, welcome. Today is our last but not least seminar in 2020. We will have two presenters today, Lin Malone and Charlotte Durham. But before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Western Australia is situated on the land of the Wajak Nyungar people. We acknowledge them as the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs, and knowledge. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. So Lynn will have 60 minutes for presentations and question and answer. After that, we will have Charlotte. Charlotte will present her research design. She'll have 30 minutes, so more or less 15 minutes for presentation and 15 minutes for question and answer. So maybe we can start with Lynn.
Thank you, Yutari. So my name is Lin Malone, and today I'll be presenting my research between home and host cultures, the use of Facebook by international students to navigate transnational cultural settings. So when I first moved to Australia many years ago, my rugby teammates used to joke that I was the quietest member of what was admittedly a very loud team. In fact, my coach actually came up to me and told me that I didn't have to worry about speaking up at trainings, that my English was actually really good. And that would have been reassuring to hear, as I had grown up in Singapore and English was my native language. I didn't know how to tell her that. I just didn't know how to connect with this team, how I fit in with this group. It was only much later. My teammates wrote something on my Facebook wall and I responded, and this led to some longer conversations. And I think this was when the whole team started to get more of a sense of who I was and what I was like beyond this shy, reserved, kind of token Asian of the group. So this was when I first started to see the value of Facebook as a platform for more than just entertainment. It was ages ago when I had no idea how to try to talk through, let alone even understand the complexities of these social interactions. I was just trying to get through my bachelor's, and I couldn't imagine that one day I would be trying to do a PhD. And here I am, many years later, hopefully in a slightly better position to talk about these things, presenting this piece of research on exactly this topic, a topic that feels so close to me in terms of bringing me a better understanding of how I managed to find my space, and a topic that I hope will help others to find their spaces as well. So this is an overview of my research study. I looked to examine the links between the international student experience, identity construction, social media, and social inclusion. To do so, I focused on two key research questions that shaped my work. So firstly, how are international students' online interactions and social media practices affected by their mobility? Secondly, how do users navigate identity production when addressing their multicultural social media audiences? So based on the data findings from each of these questions, I present a conceptual understanding of Facebook as a third space where home and host cultures intersect, and consider the wider social cultural implications of this third space. So I started this presentation with that story about how Facebook facilitated my integration to my rugby team here in Perth. There is this growing literature on the use of social media by international students that frames Facebook as a tool for integration. So this was the approach I took at the start of my PhD, to focus on how Facebook could be utilized to support international student integration. In order to examine these international students' uses of Facebook, I drew on Berry's theory of acculturation. So acculturation can basically be defined as the extent to which individuals acclimatize to host cultures while maintaining their home cultural identities. So Berry describes four modes of acculturation: assimilation, marginalization, separation, and integration. So of the four, the ideal state of acculturation is integration, at least according to Berry. So when we examine the role of ICTs in acculturation, the positive effects are often highlighted, such as the ability for ICTs to enable co-presence and the maintenance of transnational ties with homeland networks. I actually didn't manage to find any studies on the use of ICTs that shows Berry's model of assimilation, that is adoption of the host culture while rejecting the home culture. So instead, ICTs are seen to allow users to overcome obstacles of distance and time when it comes to maintaining relationships. Habuchi utilizes the term telecocoon to describe this zone of intimacy where users can continuously maintain their relationships without restriction. However, this may also describe potential negative effects of technology as in Berry's separation mode. So, for example, in the study by Kim, Yoon, and Yoon on the use of digital technologies by international students in South Korea, their focus was on communicating on their friends and family back home, and this restricted their social interactions to this telecocoon. So basically, they had this interest in maintaining relationships back home, and it took precedence over forming new relationships in their host cultural environment. But it still must be noted that in this example, although the students' interactions were limited to their home society, the internet had given them the opportunity to engage with both home and host cultures. So Chen and Hansano's work on Chinese international students in the US showed their use of Facebook to allow for social opportunities and staying updated with news in America, while their continued use of Renren allowed them to maintain ties back home. And this is an example of Berry's integration mode. So I found it also necessary to look at critiques of Berry's model, of which there are quite a few. So Wainrich discusses how reducing this process of acculturation to a choice of acceptance or rejection is actually a simplification of a very nuanced, complex process. So in actual identity processes, individuals enculturate different aspects of the cultures that they encounter. So despite my initial start, my research actually led me to question whether acculturation was the best way to define and discuss these processes that were taking place. So an alternative perspective is offered by Gomes, whose work suggests that international students tend to inhabit local identity-based social networks maintained through social media and face-to-face contact. Chang and Gomes's work describes how international students feel this sense of connection to other international students due to the similar experiences that they share. They often form communities that largely consist of other international students as a community of need while in transience. So basically this community places a focus on their identities as international students. And in Berry's model, this international student identity would probably be best described as marginalization, but it's not quite a neat fit because it could be argued that the students still maintain parts of their home cultural identities. And similarly, integration is not the right fit either because the students are marginalized within their host societies. So basically what Gomes's work does is it applies the concept of the internet as this hybridized space to a theory of identities. And from this, you can see the home culture and the international student host culture are not distinct, but meshed. And this is represented through the students' hybridized identities. So what Gomes's work does really well is it highlights the insufficiency of Berry's model as a whole, but particularly with regard to adopting an integration perspective to the use of social media by international students, as much of the previous literature was seen to do. So Page and Chabon actually argue that a key issue with international student research is the framing of the international student experience within these sort of established expectations. This means that the experiences are also framed in terms of their failure to meet these expectations. So we can see that this approach is no longer adequate, especially because integration is not actually the end goal of most of these international students. So when we consider this shift in focus towards thinking of what the students themselves desire out of their overseas experience, Facebook as a platform serves as an interesting focal point because it is located between home and host cultures. So essentially the internet has become this kind of hybridized space where users and migrants, international students can navigate these complex interactions of cultural norms and values between home and host cultures. Examining the uses of Facebook by international students could allow for insights to how international students navigate these spaces that they occupy in relation to their other spaces. So I'm now just going to shift focus from the literature that grounded my study to the actual findings of my study, the interesting part. So I collected data from semi-structured interviews with 25 international students living in WA and 29 international students living in Finland. So for both these host countries, Facebook is one of the most commonly utilized social media platforms by locals. So of the 25 international students in Australia, 13 of them were from Singapore and 12 of them were from China. And for the Finland international students, 14 of them were from China and the other 15 came from a variety of different countries, including Singapore, but also Vietnam, France, and others. So I performed a visual internet ethnographic study of the students' Facebook profiles. So what happened was the students gave me access to their Facebook profile pages by accepting my research profile as a friend. And this allowed me to analyze data from their profiles. So this analysis focused on examining the visual setup of these profile pages as a form of curated digital identity presentation. I chose to analyze Facebook profiles because of this kind of common experience I found among my participants, which is they will meet someone new, kind of get to know them a little bit, and then add them on Facebook as a way to keep in touch. So this ethnographic study was kind of set up to mirror this process where I used the interviews to get to know the students a little more, added them on the site, and scrolled through their Facebook profile pages to find out a little bit more about them. So I'm now going to introduce my findings, starting with my first research question. How are international students' online interactions and social media practices affected by their mobility? So when developing this research question, my goal was to capture how these students' moves abroad had changed the ways in which they utilize Facebook. So I'll begin by highlighting a change to the way they perceived Facebook as a social media platform, viewing it as more important to their lives as they moved overseas. So here I actually have a quote from one of my students, Sally, who was from China, and she wrote, "Here, I mean, you have to socialize with some friends here. You have to give them a like or comment or something to keep in touch with them. So you go to Facebook and see what they're doing recently or what's happening around the environment or around me or yeah. So yeah, I think it's necessary for me to browse Facebook." So as you can see, Facebook is seen as something that Sally had to engage in while she was overseas. It was necessary to her experience. So first, this kind of perceived importance actually ties to the different ways that these international students utilize Facebook as a way to connect and engage with both their home societies and their new host culture societies. So the first main change in the way that the actual ways in which these international students use Facebook while abroad was it became important as a tool for them to develop new relationships. Obviously, any part of coming to a new country is having to go through this really complicated process of meeting people. By adding new friends on Facebook, these students were actually able to follow up on the connections they made. So this kind of extended the first initial point of contact to further connections, either by private chatting or public posts or pictures. So over here, I've actually shown, this is a picture uploaded by one of my participants from Thailand. And she uploaded this after meeting some new friends in Finland. But what was interesting was how she talks about how now we are friends. So as you can see, this friendship works on two levels. They're friends in the traditional sense in terms of having met and formed that bond of camaraderie, but also they are Facebook friends and connected through the platform. So both these friendships actually inform and impact on one another. So posting content or liking or commenting on each other's posts, it's a way for users to develop that sense of camaraderie. So this is one additional way to strengthen these relationships that are, as Jonah actually says here, already so hard to maintain and establish in the first place. Another key theme highlighted in the interviews was how important it was for these students to maintain their relationships back home and how Facebook assists with this. So this is actually an excerpt from one of my interviews with Ellen, a Singaporean student in Australia. So what he says is, I guess with Facebook, the thing is I'm away from a lot of my closer friends at home. So the good thing is when I see their stuff and what they're posting, and occasionally I post stuff and they comment on my stuff, there's sort of like an interaction, I guess. So when I actually go back in the summer break, there's no like fresh new start or, oh, I haven't seen you in so long. We actually know what's going on in each other's lives through Facebook. So Facebook actually serves as this way for their audiences to have this sort of ambient awareness of the students as a reminder like, hey, I exist kind of thing. So these reminders actually may then lead to more tangible action in terms of leading to conversations or even making plans to meet up at a later date. So what this shows is even as the students try to create these new networks overseas, it's important to focus on the back home as obviously because their stay here is temporal and at some stage they'll return home, but also because their home culture relationships are still seen as so important to them. And one key way in which these students actually maintain their relationships back home was by sharing their overseas experiences. So Alan actually presents this pretty interesting perspective, talking about when he first moved to Australia, he felt this obligation to share his life here with his friends back home. So what he says is prior to this, I would just post whatever. And then when I first got here, I had this weird mentality. I felt like I was almost obliged to help, to keep my friends updated about my lives. So I would post a lot more frequently. So the other students all kind of expressed this level of need to share these new and exciting experiences with their friends back home, to let them know more about what they were going through here. So Camilla talks about sharing her experiences with food in her host country, for example. So this is, she talks about the Finnish bread here, which is, it's the Finnish people just eat on Christmas Day. So we made it ourselves and just post like to Facebook. And I just told them it's traditional food so they know that, and it's very interesting to like show this to them. So they will know it's very Finnish. And if you go to Finland, you can like just try it, something different, very different. So there's this emphasis on what was different and how the students could actually communicate these experiences to their audiences as a way to connect with them and to keep them updated. But while some of these experiences shared so far have been kind of optimistic about the use of digital technology, not all host cultural experiences were so positive. So Zainab was a postgraduate student who moved to Finland to do her PhD. And when she first came, she felt extremely isolated. You can see her talking about her experience here. She describes how she would just kind of go from place to place, trying to find a way to connect, but just she had no idea how to do it. So as she says, when you're alone, you just don't know and from who you should ask. So obviously in some ways, Zainab's experience could be seen as a bit more extreme because PhD students often don't have the structure of coursework to support their engagements with other students. But I bring it up to illustrate this kind of complicated process of trying to engage with the host cultures and the lack of support systems that most international students do face. So what actually changed Zainab's experience was she found a Facebook group for Iranians living in Finland. And through this group, she was able to ask all these questions she had, and they gave her support and help she needed about specific things, but also about general life in Finland. She talks about how these groups in Finland are really about her life in Finland, but yet what these groups did was restricted her interactions to this co-national bubble. So it demonstrates that there are these complexities to international student engagement with their host cultures. So the international students discussed two main sorts of Facebook groups that they used. So one were anchor groups that have an established presence in the offline world, and communities of practices where the groups were organized around these common passions or interests. So these groups were often larger and members of the groups might not know each other, or at least all of the other members in the group. But this pursuit of the common passion or interest structures the group's sense of communities and the relationships within the group. So for international students, many of these groups were international student groups, co-national groups, expat groups, or in the case of Finland, English-speaking foreigner groups. And they provided assistance in three kind of key ways: as a platform to crowdsource for answers to questions, as a way to gain more information about the host culture society, and as a source of support for people like Zainab. So as Elizabeth talks about here, there's no need for her to go look for these international groups back home. She has her own groups of friends and her own established support systems. But as an international student overseas, Facebook is a very valuable source of host culture information. So what these groups do is they draw on the wealth of the knowledge of crowds to provide information, creating a sense of community by showing that everyone's kind of in the same boat of having to figure things out and not having their community here with them. So this is actually summarized really nicely by Jillian. She says, half the people there have never even met, but it's like a community and we all kind of understand each other, and it's not real. Well, it is real, but it's not. It's like, I don't know. I think it's maybe because we don't have our own communities here that we try to create one online. So you can see these groups allow for support, but also information about these host culture spaces. So, and this is really important, as having this information about the host culture, including ongoing activities and events, actually shapes the students' experiences with this host culture and affects the way in which they occupy spaces within it. So I'm now just going to look at my second research question of how do users navigate identity production when addressing their multicultural Facebook audiences. So what I realized from the interviews was there is this increased awareness of the users' audiences on Facebook. So we now know Facebook is a way for us to maintain our many connections. But what this meant was international students were very aware that the digital identities produced had to be acceptable to their many different social and cultural groups. Delia explains this here, and she talks about how we present different identities when communicating with different groups in different social settings, and that she herself is more reserved when she's around people she's less familiar with, more crazy when she's around her closer friends. And essentially what she does is present a discussion of Kaufman's work on performance. But Facebook just doesn't give you that opportunity to distinguish between these social and cultural groups. As Delia says, Facebook is kind of one all. So this is actually a great quote because it kind of encapsulates the approach that most users take to Facebook, viewing it as a platform where identities should just cater to everybody. And this focus on the wider audience also led to a focus on the bigger picture. So on Facebook, we see more content about graduations, weddings, engagements, and celebrations, as these big milestones are more of a value add to a wider audience as compared to the typically mundane everyday. But we need to think about how mobility shapes the value add of the everyday. So the new cultural experiences that these students were undergoing overseas actually meant their everyday became exceptional in a way. So you know how earlier I kind of talked about how these international students viewed Facebook as a way for them to share their experiences that were so different with their audiences. So while these experiences are things that were everyday to life in that host culture, it's the international student perspective that allows them to identify how these practices differ from life back home and to present them in a way that's a value add for the audiences consuming this content. So as you can see, there's this post here by Henry, who is an international student from France. And he talks about speaking Finnish. And in some ways, this is a very everyday scenario in Finland, discussing how Finns talk. But what Henry's approach from the outsider's perspective does is it gives these experiences new meanings, because it's not about sharing what this host culture is. It's about posting these experiences as a way to demonstrate that it's a lived experience that these students have undergone. So this post about learning Finnish in Finland it doesn't just show what it was like, it shows what it was like specific to Henry's experience in it. So the curation of these experiences on Facebook actually demonstrate reflexivity in terms of presenting the international student perspective to how they navigate their host cultures. And these international students actually end up creating new meanings through these curations of their lived experiences, which are displayed and recorded on Facebook profiles as part of their digital identities. So viewing Facebook as a one-all does affect identity production in terms of the content that users post to Facebook, knowing that they have a multicultural audience on the site. So for example, Jonah is a Singaporean student living in Australia, and he talks about how he has to be careful writing on Facebook because of the Australians he has as part of his audience. So he feels like he's not able to use Singaporean slang English or Singlish. He ensures that his textual content on Facebook utilizes proper English to tailor his one-or identity to his audiences. And it's also important to recognize that this content posted also serves as a means of communication. So certain content that feature is more relevant to some groups of audiences, and users have to be able to direct content to their audiences. This takes place in two ways, through utilizing language and using headers and tags on Facebook. So many of the international students for whom English was not their first language actually learned to utilize language as a way to distinguish between their groups of audiences on Facebook and to direct specific content towards specific groups. So when it comes to sharing experience, they ensured their friends and family back home knew that certain content was intended for them through using their native language. So for example, Catherine from Vietnam posted this post in Vietnamese. So she was sharing a new post that she had written on her blog about why she loves Finland. And you can see from the translation here, this is actually with the kind of clear intention of trying to get more Viets to come to Finland. And it's this kind of clear intended purpose that structures the language that this message is presented in as a post so that her Vietnamese friends won't, as she says, just skip past it. So she's able to connect it to the relevant audiences. And this is also done in other ways. So first, it takes place through the overt addressing of specific groups. So in this post, one of the participants actually was addressing her non-Thai friends and telling them a bit more about what was going on in her home culture. Yet another way in which this is done is by tagging other users in posts, and this addressed that post to a specific audience. So in this post, the student shared this meme on Australian English to her wall and tagged another international student in it to ensure that her friend would see this comment and probably be entertained by it. So both these methods of communication actually direct content to their relevant audiences. And the last way in which they distinguish between their groups on Facebook while still kind of addressing this one-or identity is using different platforms to distinguish between their groups of audiences. So the uses and gratifications theory argues that media consumption is actively tailored according to the individual's personal needs. So here we can see Delia discussing how other platforms such as Instagram changed the way in which she and others utilize Facebook. So most of the needs are very driven by the physical environments, and this can be seen in the use of Facebook by Chinese students overseas. So for the Chinese students in Finland and Australia, Facebook is banned in China, so there's no real need for them to use it back home. But overseas, as Sally says here, now I always use Facebook because I need to use it in Finland. So because of this, we can see their use of Facebook actually solely focuses on their lives abroad in Finland and Australia and their audiences here, while their use of other social media platforms directs the content to their audiences back home in China. So now I'm just gonna kind of try to wrap some of these things up by presenting an overarching analysis of this research data. So through examining the findings from my first two research questions, I present a conceptualization of Facebook as a third space. So firstly, what is a third space? So this notion of hybridity is proposed by Baba in relation to the third space, describing it as an in-between position where third perspectives can grow in the margins of the dominant ways of seeing. So as culture is only constructed in relation to the other, the third space serves as an ambivalent site where cultural meaning and representation have no primordial unity or fixity, and thus may open up a new area for the negotiation of meaning and representation. So basically, the third space exists between home and host cultures, and is a way of thinking of the formation of something new resulting from this mix of cultures. So positioning Facebook as a third space is intended as a way to understand how these international students navigate between home and host cultures on Facebook. So from my first two research questions, I actually had these two sets of data, which I utilized to come up with this kind of initial model to understanding Facebook as a third space. And I'd like you to bear in mind that this model still needs a bit of tweaking in order to fully encapsulate the complexities of these processes. So I would really welcome any feedback that you guys might have on this. So Basically, as part of the move abroad by migrants, an introduction to their new host culture can be seen. But rather than looking at this kind of culture as a whole, the key focus is on the migrants' lived experiences within these cultures. So this is when some of the data from the first research question comes in, because we can clearly see that social media shapes the ways in which these users interact and engage with their host culture in differing degrees. So looking at these personal lived experiences allows for a much needed shift in focus away from looking at integration as the end goal towards just understanding the different ways in which these migrants engage or choose not to engage with their host cultures. So what we can do is I actually draw on Giddens' reflexive project of the self to present this understanding of how international students might process these experiences in relation to this innate self-narrative they hold and consider these as experiences alongside their current relationship to the home culture as part of their identities. So these experiences actually impact the students' perceptions of each culture and how they position themselves between them. So we can kind of then think through how some of these experiences may be reproduced on Facebook, utilizing its different tools to curate and shape this experience, such as using photos, such as sharing content, such as putting up videos or just textual posts. And all of this is then published as a post. So this post actually serves as a performance of identity on two levels. It exists by itself as a mark of identity, such as when you view someone's content through their newsfeed, but also filters back into this online narrative constructed by the user through Facebook's timeline. So both the post as an individual mark of identity and the Facebook profile as a digital representation of the user online is then offered to the user's audiences for them to consume this content. And obviously, in some ways, this feeds back into the identities that they've created for themselves. So I'll remind you guys again that this model does need development. So I would appreciate any feedback you have. But since I've presented this model for understanding Facebook as a third space, I want to discuss some of the characteristics of this space. So first of all, when trying to understand Facebook as a third space, it is important to note that these students are situated between home and host countries, and they actually connect with members of both of these spaces on Facebook. So creating these kind of one-or identities as digital avatars to communicate with both these groups are also a way for users to reflect on their connections to each of these cultures. So these posts serve as a way for them to understand how they're situated within these cultures and to become more aware of the social and cultural spaces that they occupy in these societies. And with regard to these kind of connections formed on Facebook, the agency that the space offers is also very important. So the main focus would be on Facebook as a space that kind of evidences how international students practice needs response agency. So what this refers to is the international students' responses to the structural and social contexts surrounding them and identifying their needs in their host countries based on this. We've discussed these kind of different ways in which Facebook is able to mediate experiences with home and host cultures. But what this engagement is really dependent on is the ways that the user chooses to use Facebook. So Facebook gives them this degree of agency over how they choose to engage with their host societies and with back home. So rather than focusing on the opportunities of engagement that Facebook offers, it's actually more important to focus on the ways and the chances they're given to make these decisions and exert agency in this space. Agency is also seen in agency for becoming, which is what this refers to is agency in the international students' individual self-transformation. And you can see this in the curation of Facebook identities, which we've kind of talked a bit about. And this leads me to my third characteristic of the third space, which is individuality. So in new host societies, part of the process of identity construction is about the reconciliation of different cultural elements in relation to how they tie to our sense of self. So Beck and Beck-Gershom's work on individualization in today's society argues that those who live in this post-national global society are constantly engaged in discarding old classifications and formulating new ones. So the hybrid identities and cultures that ensue are precisely the individuality that then determines social integration. So this argument actually aligns to Giddens' reflexive project of the self, in that the self-assessment undergone allows for the construction of coherent self-narratives that include elements, hybrid elements of both home and host cultures. So the third space can actually be seen to allow individuals to form new meanings through the meshing and repurposing of different cultural elements, which mirrors the hybrid identity construction of international students. And I think that this concept as a whole better reflects these students' experiences. I know this has been actually a really full-on presentation, and I do appreciate the time and attention you've given me. So I know at this stage, probably the main question is, so what? What does any of this matter? Well, by understanding how these international students exert agency, display individuality, and harvest connections through Facebook, this is the first step towards moving past that integration framework to letting these students' voices be heard. From this, we can actually consider how best to offer the students the support they need, as opposed to kind of imposing our expectations of what they need on them. So part of this might be making them more aware of the communities and networks of support available to them inside and outside of the university, such as on Facebook. And I'm gonna again return to Zainab's experience. She talks about how things were really bad and they only got better when she realized these forms of support available to her. So I'm a bit hesitant to use the word digital natives because it's somewhat reflective of the tendency to think of young people engaging with digital technologies as being instinctive and somewhat self-explanatory, but it is in some ways evidenced through it because there's this presupposed level of digital competence among young people that is actually not necessarily the case. And in addition, there are these other complications when it comes to thinking of the use of digital technologies by migrants. So sometimes they're not familiar with the platform, as was in the case of the Chinese students. And sometimes the information is just hidden from them and they don't know where to start looking. So making these students aware of these groups could allow for migrants to have more positive experiences by giving them the agency to tailor their own experiences to what they themselves desire of their time abroad. So I'm just going to wrap up here and thank you guys for your time and patience with me. And if you have any questions or feedback, I would really love to hear it.
Thank you, Lin. Yeah, very good timing. We still have more or less 15 minutes for question and answer. So I haven't seen. If you want to ask questions, you can raise the blue hand on the participants. Oh, yes, we have question now. Greg.
Hi, thanks, Lynn. That was really informative. I learned an awful lot from that. I have a question that you may not be able to answer because I don't know when your observations stopped. But your model seems to presume that the international students are present for their lived experiences in the host society. We're now in a phase where a lot of international students are no longer physically present in the host society. They're still international students, but they're in their home society. And the new normal of COVID-19. Have you noticed any changes in the last 2/3 of a year, since March or so, in how people present identities on Facebook, other social media and such, given that they're differently situated now? Or can you speculate on how this new this new model of international students staying in their home society, which is likely to become more prevalent now, even when or if COVID-19 recedes, how that would change how you're conceptualizing that model? Thanks.
That's actually a really great question. So most of my data collection actually ended before the whole pandemic started, but just because it was such an interesting topic, I had to conduct a few interviews at the start of this year because I wanted to know the answers to the exact things that you were looking at. So what I found was, I'll speak to identity presentation in a moment, but firstly, there was this importance of Facebook as this kind of source of support for international students who couldn't come back, or even the international students who were here. So in terms of those who couldn't come back, some of them actually set up these groups talking about getting flights back, talking about who they should talk to. I think for the Chinese students, they used WeChat to ask each other, like, have you managed to get a flight back? Or if they had any information, everything just went up on these groups. So obviously, as a tool for information, the pandemic has made this kind of Facebook's position as this source of information that much more important. Second of all, for the students who were living in hall and had to be quarantined when they came back, connecting through beyond these kind of like communities of practice, the anchored groups of people they actually knew in hall, it was a good way for them to kind of support one another. So like making sure like, oh, is everything okay in your room down the hall that I can't visit you, but I know you're there kind of thing. So that was interesting as the ways that they were using it for information and connecting. As for identity production, that was a little bit different because rather than focusing on these new experiences, there was a little bit of a shift to focusing on how I'm getting through this. So I saw that some of the participants were uploading a bit more news on the site. So like Perth restrictions are extended, or Melbourne is going through this. So it became a bit more about these are my current living conditions rather than the lived experiences that I talked about before. So I'm obviously, as things start to shift and we now know that the borders could potentially open in a few weeks, maybe some of this would change, that there'll be a bigger focus on kind of like letting their families know back home what they're up to, or it could be just a focus on living life here. But I think some of that is a kind of wait and see moment. Does this answer your question, Greg? Thank you.
Okay, so more questions for Lin? Can I just have a question for you, Lin?
Yeah.
I'm very interested to know, like, you add them as your friend, then what will happen after you finish the study? I mean, like, in terms of ethics and also, I mean, the friendship and everything, what would happen? Like, are you befriend or unfriend them or what?
So when I set up my ethics, basically instead of looking to add them as a friend on my personal Facebook profile, I actually set up a research Facebook profile. So that profile essentially has all my participants on it, actually 2 separate profiles. And under ethics, one of the questions asked was, how long will you have access to this data for? And I put it as a 5-year period just to give myself a bit of wiggle room in terms of being able to go back and look at the profiles. So I think at the end of this, I might just delete that entire profile because it seems like the best way to manage this, that I will no longer be able to keep seeing what they post up, which goes beyond that 5-year period. Yeah. I think Farida has a question on it.
Yes.
Sorry, does that answer your question, Yutari?
Yes, definitely. Thanks. So I think I just read the questions for everyone. This is from Farida. Is Barry's model the most appropriate, given that international students aren't really acculturating, between quotes, according to his model, as they know they are temporary? And how do exclusionary forces, racism, complacency of the majority factor into the interactional processes?
I think why I used Barry's model was to show that a lot of the previous literature actually did kind of feed into these different modes described in Barry's model. So it wasn't necessarily that Barry's model kind of like says, Barry's model talks about these specific categories with regard to international students, but that the ways in which the international students' experiences had been talked about actually fed into it, which was kind of problematic in terms of this kind of like, yes, you engage in, or you know you do not engage. There's no idea of the new nuances that this engagement entails. So that's why I kind of started off using Mary's model and essentially used that as a way to shift away from thinking of this from the integration perspective, if that makes sense. And as to the exclusionary forces such as racism, complacency of the majority, so this is why I kind of wanted to focus on the lived experiences within these cultures. So I had some of the international students come to me and tell me about how they've experienced these really negative experiences in Australia or Finland, where some of the locals have come to them and said just nasty things. And when I look at this kind of lived experience in terms of identity, these negative engagements actually show that they're more likely to want to go home, they're more likely to want to engage with their home cultures in a way, and that is reproduced on their Facebook profiles. So currently that's where I'm at, but I think developing on some of these themes would probably make my research stronger as a whole. Farida, does that answer your question?
Farida? Thanks, Lynn. Great work. That's from Farida.
Oh,
okay. Katie.
Thank you. Thanks, Lynn. That was really interesting. I'm sorry if I missed this. I had a few distractions early on, but I'm really curious as to why you chose Finland and Australia, and whether, you know, Danny Miller, obviously he does, his whole project has been really interesting in looking at the cultural differences that emerge in terms of, you know, the various, you know, different cultural groups and people involved in. So I'm really interested in whether you found, like, whether there was sort of, you know, a more comparative, any takeaways between those two contexts, and also in terms of the different nationalities of the students that you talked about. And also, I suspect the answer is no to this, but was there any generational differences? Were there any mature age students involved? And if so, did they utilise these forums in different ways?
Oh, that is actually a really great question, because initially when I started this whole PhD, my focus was on just international students in Australia. And I was looking at some projects done overseas on how students tend to struggle more in countries where English isn't the first language. And I kept thinking to myself, so how does this model of using Facebook as a way to navigate these kind of home and host cultures extend to these non-English speaking countries? So there was a research opportunity in Finland that I ended up taking because there was a group who was doing work on this subject. And that's why I ended up working in Finland as well as here. As to kind of the findings of the studies, actually it was really interesting because in Finland, like I mentioned, there was this English-speaking foreigner group, and this group was actually so important to so many of the students because they didn't know where else to get information. So you had Zainab, who would go to university and just kind of walk around and not be able to speak to anyone. But I also had students who would go to the bus station and just not be able to communicate. I want to buy a bus ticket somewhere, what do I do? And having these Facebook groups was actually a great way for them to find this information. And if you think about the comparison to Australia, it's easy enough to find the answers to these questions. But Australia, the students focused a bit more on finding information that was not as readily available. So it's less about how do I buy a bus ticket and more about how do I find the best chicken rice in Perth, these kind of things. So that was the kind of main switch I realized. And also I think with Finland, there seemed to be a lot more emphasis on the cultural differences, because I think some of the things that the international students felt they saw there was that much more unexceptional. So things like seeing the northern lights, things like seeing snow, these things were really big experiences for the students and tended to feature more on their profiles presented. So maybe this.
I imagine you had lots of spa posts.
Yes.
Or sauna, sorry, got spa.
The saunas, the spas, skinny dipping in the lake. That was something I maybe did not want to see so much. Nonetheless, it was there. And I think as to the generational differences, I did have some postgrad students in Finland, but they weren't significantly older. They were all pretty active on Facebook. So perhaps that could be an area for future research, looking at how generational differences might change the ways in which they use social media as a tool for navigating home and host spaces. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Oh, okay. We have Dorinda.
Thanks, Lynn, for that. It was really interesting, and I've been reading a little bit of your stuff already, so to get the whole picture was really good. Thanks for that. I did ask for feedback on your model, and I don't have it up here now, of course, because you're not sharing anymore, but I did just have a question, particularly actually when you started talking to the next slides, and I think it had to do with the third space. And my question is that because you have the element of performance and identity performance, and then also that cyclic thing going back, you had the circles in there. Does your model adequately show the difference between the way, say, non-international students use Facebook and the international students? Because you have a unique study, but is that particular element reflected in the model?
I'm just going to pull up my own model so I can look at it myself.
And it could be that I don't see it anymore, and that's why I've forgotten.
So what I do is I look at how the home culture and the host culture spaces actually influence on identity. And I think that's the focus which non-international students don't have. Obviously, they may have other spaces influencing on identity, but for this model, by bringing in not just the host cultural space, but the lived experience within the host cultural space and how it influences on identity, I think that's probably where it differs a bit from a non-international student perspective. And in terms of audiences, international students do tend to have more international friends from different spaces. And obviously this, again, impacts on the identities produced. So I think from a non-international perspective, the audiences are more of a current kind of home cultural space. And there's no need to cater to, say, differences in how you communicate, differences in understandings, and that kind of shifts the way these identities are produced. I think thinking through how actually pinning down the differences will probably be a good way to think of how this works specifically in relation to international students. So that's actually a really great piece of feedback. Thank you, Dorinda.
Okay. No worries, thank you.
Yeah.